what this is a part 2. A month ago, you remember that we did the part 1, which was looking at what codependency is. So what I thought I would do is kind of do a real quick refresher of that, and then we'll go on to part 2, which is, so now what? You know, what do we do once we figure out that, by golly, yes, we're codependent? You know, which if you're human and you're alive and still breathing, you're codependent. That kind of keeps it simple, but yeah. So let's look at this for a moment. Last time I started off with this triangle. This is called the drama triangle. And the drama triangle is how people function. It is what underlies human dynamics. And you can tell that because every book ever written, every TV show, every movie, every play has these dynamics. You have a bad guy, you have a victim, and you have a good guy. There you go. That's humanity's primary dynamics. And that happens both externally and internally. And why is it called the drama triangle? Because it creates and maintains drama, both in here and on the outside of us. It is run by the emotions that are generated by this triangle are blame, shame, guilt, fear, and anger. And, you know, if you listen to the news more than 5 minutes, there you go. You know, that's kind of what you hear. Blame, shame, guilt, you know, anger and fear. Lots of fear these days, lots of anger these days. And that keeps us all stuck in the triangle. And how does this work? Because I have somebody who wasn't here, 2 people who weren't here last time. I'm going to just real quickly run through this. Internally, most of us have what in addictions we call that negative self-talk. You know, that stuff that makes us feel bad about ourselves. Well, internally that we would consider that the persecutor. Then we also have our excuses and our rationalizations and our justifications for those same behaviors, and that would be our internal rescuer. Is this making sense so far? And of course, the persecutor makes us feel like we're a victim. If you've ever struggled to fall asleep at night and you've got too many things going on in your brain, do you not feel victimized by your thinking or by your own brain? Absolutely. It happens all the time to people. Or people will say, well, you know, I can think of, well, never mind. That, you know, I don't know, I worry all the time. I don't know how not to. So worry is all about this triangle. Trying to control things outside of us and always being aware of, looking at the negative possibility as being the only thing that is likely to happen, which is not true, but that's what worry centers on. So again, fear, anger, blame, guilt, and shame are what drive that internally. On the outside, typically, again, we look at we think people make us have certain feelings, they make us do certain things. You know, the government makes me do this, my boss makes me do that, my wife makes me do this, my husband won't let me do that. Those are the kind of statements that we hear that reflect this triangle. Somebody won't let me do something, or they're doing something to me. I feel victimized by them, and typically there'll be somebody in my life who will act as my rescuer, who will tell me, well, it's not really your fault. It's okay. Oh, they're being mean to you. Oh, yeah, your boss really doesn't like you. He just is always taking advantage of you or whatever. So this is a position that typically makes the excuses for us. And or, if you happen to have addiction, maybe bail you out of jail a lot. So this is the dynamics of how humans both think about themselves as well as project outwards and interact with others. I recognize I'm going through this really quickly, so if you have any questions or you're not sure about something, please ask, because from us it's more of a review. This is what supports this definition, which is what codependency is. Codependency we used to think it was those people who enabled an addict to continue in their addiction, because that's where the idea got started. However, what we've come to realize is that it's far more pervasive than that. It has really nothing to do with the person in our lives who might be using a chemical, but rather it's simply learned behaviors and beliefs expressed by dependency on people and things outside of the self. So if you look at that, I mean, do you know anyone who isn't dependent on people or things outside of themselves for their sense of self-worth and value? I've never met anybody. I mean, many of us are working on creating a more internal ways of valuing ourselves, but I've never met anybody who isn't dependent on people and or things outside of themselves. It could be their job, could be their social position, could be their financial position, could be their position in the family, could be their spouse or their husband or their mother or their sister. But it's like we're trained from the time we are knee-high to a grasshopper to look outside of ourselves for validation, look outside of ourselves for safety, look outside of ourselves for our sense of worth and value. And while that is certainly very normal, in the long run, it's not very healthy for us. And therein lies the problem. So the first thing that I want to say to everybody is that codependency is absolutely perfectly normal, period. Everybody has some. I've not yet. I mean, there might be, a Dalai Lama or a really incredibly spiritual person that doesn't have any codependency, but I don't know them, and I know I'm still struggling with it. So codependency is what is normal. Unfortunately, we have a tendency as humans to think that if something is normal, that means it's okay, right? I mean, everybody does it. If everybody's like this, what's the big deal? Well, it's kind of like saying, the American diet is healthy. Yeah, not so much. Every other indigenous culture that eats our diet starts getting really sick, right? I mean, we know that the, quote, typical American diet is really unhealthy, but it's normal, right? So they're not the same thing. And so that would be one of the things I really want to be clear. Codependency, yes, is normal. That does not make it healthy. And with every generation, it gets less and less healthier because the stress that is involved in this continues to build. And as that builds with each generation, then we find bigger and more serious consequences of it. And again, I invite you to spend 10 minutes listening to the news from this perspective, and you'll begin to hear how pervasive and the pressure that this dynamic creates. But for our benefit, for what we're looking at today, we're looking at this. So as a result of this, these dependencies on people and things outside of the self, part of that is that we diminish and neglect our true worth, our sense of self. Because if I depend on your opinion of me for me to feel okay, or getting that particular position at work in order for me to have value, or whatever it may be, then I diminish the intrinsic value that I have. And after a while, I no longer even remember that I have it. And again, therein lies part of the difficulty with codependency, is that after a while, the only way we know to validate ourselves is outside of us. That false self that we come to believe we are is this. The codependency roles. That's the false self. And that is created as a result of these dependencies on people and things outside of ourselves for our sense of worth and value. And at Pavillon, one of the cornerstones of Pavillon treatment is that we are in fact not a body seeking a spiritual experience, but in fact a spirit, perfect spiritual being having a human experience. And that is a really different way of looking at things. And that is my intrinsic value. That is my intrinsic value. But this makes me forget that. So the child, and we learn these things in our family of origins. Those are the primary people who teach us what is expected of us and how we're supposed to be when we grow up. And they are our first models. As a result of that, please keep in mind, I'm really giving a condensed version here since we did this more in detail last time, is that the childhood patterns that we were using to try to figure out where we fit in our families, where we fit in the world, those adaptations that we tried out, the ones that seemed to work the best to get our needs met, the ones that seemed to work the best to keep us feeling safe, as much as that occurred, those are the ones that in adulthood typically become these codependency roles. And we may well have more than one, but typically we have one or two that are predominant most of the time. And these roles are caretaker, people pleaser, martyr, compulsive performer, perfectionist, and tap dancer. Now, I'm not going to go through those to any real length because we want to get into, so what do we do about this stuff? I know you have a handout. Please feel free to ask me any questions you want to ask. Does anybody have anything they want to ask me before I go into the next piece? In terms of just moving from the very quick review. So actually, let me go one more thing here. Caretaker is that person who's going to take care of you, whether you want them to or not. The core of that is, I need to be needed. So even though oftentimes the caretaker looks like they are there to help, they're really not. Yes, it looks that way. But what it really is that I need to be needed, so I need to help you so that I feel like I'm okay. That's how I get my need to be needed met. People pleasing, I just need everybody to like me. Just everybody to like me. And if there's one person who doesn't like me, it really is very distressful. And I will avoid conflict at all costs because conflict makes me totally crazy. And so I will always tell you what I think you want to hear. I will always be what I think you want me to be. And so I will be that chameleon. The martyr is the one who suffers not very quietly and really thrives on their suffering. No matter what the situation is, they will always have a tendency to see the negative. You know, they just got this great raise, but oh my God, there's going to be so much more work. You know, whatever it is, there's always a negative to it, and that's what they emphasize. And their suffering is worse than anybody else's, right? So that's the martyr. The compulsive performer is that person who defines their worth and value by what they do. So you see this a lot for people who are professionals. When they can no longer do, they die because they don't have any purpose anymore. So compulsive performers are always doing, they're human doings rather than human beings, and they will have a tendency to always define themselves as what they are in the process of accomplishing. The perfectionist is a person who is always looking for the flaws in everybody, including themselves. You would think with perfectionists they'd be looking for what's perfect, right? But no, not really. They're looking for all the flaws. And they have a real strong tendency to always, of course, find them because, you know, as humans, we have a tendency to have a lot of flaws. So the perfectionist is always demanding of perfection, and they tend to be very black and white. You know, it's right or wrong, black or white. And so anything that is about process, growth, for instance, change, that doesn't fit well for a perfectionist. It's a real struggle for them because I'm either right or I'm wrong. So if I need to change something or I want to improve something, that kind of means I'm wrong, right? Well, oh no, I'm not going to be wrong. And so I will just stay frozen in where I'm at. And it will be very difficult for me to move forward in something. The tap dancer is that person who struggles making a commitment. They will tend to see commitment as being a trap. They are people for whom the grass is always greener on the other side. And then when they get to the other side, it's not really that green anymore. And so they have to go somewhere else. And then that's not so green either. And so they're always tend to be bouncing around, whether it be jobs, neighborhoods, cities, like the typical army brat, you know, the military. Very often when they get out, they are, even if they weren't in the military themselves, but they were a family off, very often when they get out, they really struggle staying in one place for more than a couple of years because they're supposed to move, right? They're never satisfied staying in one place. So those are the really short versions of what these roles are. really short. Any thoughts or questions on that summary real quick? If we identify with any of the codependency stuff, we might even be able to begin to see some of the ways in which these codependency dynamics create some problems in our lives. Like maybe I feel exhausted all the time because I'm so busy doing for other people. I'm so busy taking care of other people that I don't take care of myself. And so I'm exhausted all the time. Or maybe I feel like nothing I want is really that important because I'm so busy people pleasing all the time. Or maybe I get sick because I am so busy doing that I don't rest. And so I end up getting very possibly physically ill. We will do that. Sometimes for some of us, the only time we take a break is when we're sick. And so our body will go, okay, let's make you sick so that you'll shut down for a minute and rest. So there are loads of ways in which the codependency dynamics show themselves in our lives. So as we begin to identify them, what do we need to begin doing about it? Well, step one, always, is awareness. I can't change anything until I'm at a minimum aware of it. And honestly, that's probably not going to be enough to motivate me to really change. What usually, unfortunately, motivates us is pain. It's got to hurt bad enough. I have to be exhausted enough, frequently enough, that I just get tired of it. I can't do it anymore. Or maybe I've messed up enough relationships that I finally begin to go, the commonality in all these relationships is me. Maybe I need to do something here. I need to start looking here instead of continuing to look out here at my relationships and the problems they have in my mind. But in some way, typically, it is pain that gets us moving. And at first, most of the time, that pain, at least in part, has come from us trying to manipulate and change the people around us. 9 times out of 10, that's the source of the not the pain, but the suffering that we create. So I keep trying to take care of you, and you don't let me. You're resistant to it. Or maybe I have done everything I can think of to keep you happy with me, and yet, you keep criticizing me. What I'm doing is trying to manipulate so that I feel okay, only it's not working. And so I begin to get maybe angry, maybe I get resentful, maybe I get depressed, maybe I develop anxiety. All typically as a result of my efforts in trying to control people, places, and things that I have no control over. So one of the first things that is important for us to begin doing is taking a step back from that and letting that, I'm not going to say the desire to control, because I don't know if that ever changes. I'm not sure. I still have the desire to control, but I just don't act on it the way I used to. So let me not say that. We have to take a step back and begin to take responsibility for our own pain. Take responsibility for the suffering that we have created. Believe it or not, nobody else creates any of that for us. We create it all. And that's hard because that does not fit here. This is all about blame. And we're all raised to blame and look at others. You made me mad. You hurt my feelings, right? You make me feel unimportant. That's all this stuff. And what I'm saying to you is that's not true. That isn't true. Let me show you real quickly how the mind actually functions. So most of us are trained and taught that something happens, some situation occurs, somebody says or does something, my date didn't show up, so he or she made me feel unimportant, rejected, unloved, whatever it is. But it's the stimulus that is directly causing the reaction. And that fits in the drama triangle. You or the situation makes me feel or react in a particular way. And that is actually absolutely not how the mind works. Despite the fact that universally we're all taught that. But it isn't how the mind actually functions. What actually happens, this is where you have a copy of what I'm getting ready to put up on the board, and it includes my little person that I always draw. So let me draw my person. because that's important to me. It helps to center me. So here's my person. This is the only thing I ever have been able to draw. And you notice I only do the head because that's where we think the mind lands, but it really doesn't. But that's a whole other topic of discussion. So let me show you what actually really happens. Something occurs. Somebody says something, does something, doesn't do something I think they should have done, and I should all over them, whatever. And I then interpret it. I interpret the stimulus. I give the stimulus meaning. My way of saying it is I make up a story about it. So you didn't show up for our date, so you must not like me. It never occurs to me that you might have had a flat tire, right? I automatically, especially if I'm over here in the triangle, I'm going to assume it must be about me. You don't like me, or I might blame you and go, you're a real SOB, right? But in some way, this is to blame for how I feel. The reality is it's my interpretation that creates my feelings. If I were to first think, wow, I wonder what happened, maybe I should call and find out, I probably wouldn't feel rejected, hurt, angry. I would just be curious. Gee, I wonder why this person didn't show up. They said they would. Isn't that interesting? But how many of us go to neutrality when something of that nature happens? Or curiosity? Most of us immediately, typically, end up in here somewhere because that's what we're trained to do. But what I'm telling you is this. Our interpretation, the meaning we give the stimulus is what creates our emotions, and it is our emotions that compel our behaviors. That's how the mind actually functions. This interpretation is the story we make up. Has anybody in here ever changed their mind about anything? just once or twice, right? Right, so which one was really the truth? The first interpretation you had, where you absolutely knew you were right? Because we're also trained to always think that whatever it is we're thinking is really real and true. So at that moment, the first time, my first opinion, I really believed, right? I thought that was real and true, and I acted as if it was. But then, maybe a few years later, or whenever it might be, I reflect on it and realize, well, it could have been something else. And now I'm convinced it's something different, right? So which one of those was really true? I believe both of them were true. Was one of them more true than the other? Right? We're trained to believe our stories. But what I want you to hear is that they're not true. None of them are true, because truth can't change. Our interpretation of truth can change, and God knows it does all the time, right? But truth itself really can't change. Only my interpretation does, or the story I make up, the meaning I give, is what changes. And as I get more life experience, that impacts the interpretation I give events from my past, does it not? Thank goodness I don't still see things the way I did when I was 20. I would be a very unhappy 72-year-old, right? But luckily we do grow and learn from our experiences, and then we continue to reinterpret things, or we reframe them is one of the terms we oftentimes use. And what is part of to me, part of the insanity of being human is that it never occurs to us that what that means is I probably shouldn't be believing my thoughts to begin with. I mean, if they're not true, why should I believe them? And yet we never think about that, do we? We just continue along as if whatever this is real and true. Because that's all we know to do. But what if we were to begin challenging this? Like somebody, walks down the hallway and I say, good morning, maybe one of my peers at work. And I say, good morning, Scott, and Scott keeps on walking by. How might I interpret that? What story might I make up about that? That was an actual question. He must be angry at me. What else?
What a jerk.
What a jerk. What a, yeah, that could be it. What?
He doesn't like me.
He's got something on his mind.
He doesn't like me.
He doesn't like me. So who determines which one of those is true? I mean, were you ever trained to walk up to the person and say, hey, listen, this morning you walked by me and you didn't say anything after I said hello? What was going on? What should I feel about that? Do we ever do that? We just assume that the story we made up is true, and we react to that. So if we want to begin coming out of these codependency roles, we've got to start challenging how we think. With questions like, is this really my responsibility to do my child's homework for them? That has become, in my mind, a real problem. Parents are doing the homework for the children because they want them to get good grades, thinking that they're helping the child. But then the child doesn't learn anything. That's one of the problems with this position. We rob the child of the ability to learn from their mistakes because we don't let them make any. So it's important to begin, one of the first things we've got to develop some skill in is questioning. Questioning what we are thinking. And none of us typically have any training in that. We're all trained to just assume the story is correct until some evidence, some reflection later on shows us that, oh, maybe there could have been another reason, right? But what I want to encourage you to begin considering is questioning every response that you have. Ooh, that sounds like a lot of work, doesn't it? Yeah. But once you get in the habit of it, it's really not so hard. It's just about asking yourself, because when I say challenge, it's like asking yourself, how did I create this reaction? Positive or negative? How did I create this reaction? How did I make myself feel guilty about not wanting to go visit Mom this weekend? How did I make myself guilty about that? Mom didn't make me feel guilty. She may have said something, but she's not the one that made me feel guilty. I did. I make myself feel guilty. I make myself feel ashamed. I make myself feel unimportant because nobody else can do it for me. Again, if you want proof, has anybody in here ever had anybody say something nice to them? Something kind, something complimentary, right? Yeah. And what did you do with that comment? Did you bring it in, let it land, and when you think about it, you still feel good about it? Yeah, not so much, huh? Most of the time, we tend to discount them, right? In some way, we make them not count. Oh, if they only knew, right? Oh, what, this whole thing? Oh my gosh, this is ancient, but thank you for saying I look nice tonight. I appreciate it. So I discount it in some way. Oh, anybody could have made that. It's not that big a deal. And then we wonder why we're empty inside, why we need more validation from the outside. How can we ever fill up if we keep throwing out the good stuff people are giving us, right? It makes it really hard. And on top of that, I'm criticizing myself. I'm telling myself that what I did wasn't good enough. Oh, this whole thing? Oh, anybody could have done that. What I did wasn't that big a deal, right? So we keep ourselves feeling empty. We keep ourselves afraid that maybe we really aren't good enough. Is this kind of ringing home to anybody? Yeah. So this is how we perpetuate our neediness, our dependency. I abuse myself with my thoughts. In fact, I want you to pause for a second. How many of you would say to someone else what you say about yourself in your head? Unless maybe you're really pissed off, or drunk or something, right? Yeah. Yeah. There are extenuating circumstances, absolutely. Especially if it was somebody you actually loved. Would you speak to someone that you loved the way you speak to yourself in your own head? For most people, the answer to that is, yeah, no way. So how are we supposed to ever feel good about ourselves if we're constantly, in some fashion, telling ourselves we're not enough, or shaming ourselves, or guilting ourselves by all of this that goes on in our own head? How do we ever move out of these roles of dependency if we don't begin to take responsibility for what we're doing to ourselves? So the first step is owning that I'm the one doing it, and then become willing to practice some skills. Because nothing's going to change with awareness alone. It would be nice if it did. That'd be pretty cool. But yeah, it's just unfortunately not that easy. We actually have to take action. So in your handout, the stack of papers over there in front of you, there are just like some questions you can begin asking yourself. How do you begin to challenge this process? There are two in there. One is just questions you can ask yourself, and the other is actually, I came up with it today. At Pavillon, we have this thing called an ABCD sheet. And what I did was take that and just make it into something a little simpler. Yeah, let me have that, please.
Thoughts challenge.
Yeah. And I just call it thought challenging. So this is a tool that you can actually begin using to help you get in the habit of not assuming that your thoughts are accurate and true. Because they're not. And that willingness to begin questioning and challenging, how do I know this is true? How do I know that if I set this boundary, my sister isn't going to speak to me anymore? I just know that's what's going to happen, right? How do I know that? Well, because she hasn't spoken to me at other times. Okay, but does that mean this time's going to be the same? Or am I just assuming it will be the same? How do I know that my boss doesn't like me? Did he tell me he didn't? Or am I just assuming that since he didn't promote me, he must not like me? Beginning to challenge those thoughts. What am I actually saying in my head? What's my story? And is that story actually true? And if it is, where's my evidence? When I think to myself, well, I've got to help. If I'm coming from that caretaker role. Yeah, but, I can't do this because I've really got to go help mom out. Who says I have to? Where is that written? Well, I want to be a good daughter. Where is it written if I don't go this weekend, I'm a bad daughter? Right? Another question I often ask myself is, who died and made me God? That I think that I've got to fix everybody else, or that I even can. That is somehow my responsibility to do. So being willing to question and challenge is a huge piece of beginning to work through and come out of some of these codependency patterns of thinking, because it's not just behavior, it's also the internal patterns in here that create the behaviors and the reactions. Is this making sense, folks? Yeah, cool. So I just want to make sure I'm clear. I mean, things are oftentimes clear in here, but that doesn't mean they come out clear, So this model is one that can be very helpful. It's not like, the end all, but it's a good place to start, and it's simple. And for those of you who may not have done this yet, one of the things I recommend a lot is a book, and it's called The 4 Agreements. Yeah, I see some nods on that. I recommend it all the time because it's got 4 simple principles that are universally true, and they really can be applied to any situation. And they fit. They fit this model perfectly. Perfectly. And so anything that I can do to nurture me coming out of this and coming into this pattern, I need to do. And trust me when I say to you, there is nothing out in our culture that is going to encourage you to come over here. Our culture is going to encourage you to stay here, because that's how our culture functions. And it's not just ours, but it's the only one I can talk about. I could talk about others, but I don't know them. I know ours, you know? So if I want to shift over here and really start taking responsibility for me, then I'm going to need some support. Which then brings us to another piece. Change doesn't happen in isolation. You know, we all need support. And that can come in a variety of ways. That can be some friends, that could be family, that could be a therapist, that could be going to a 12-step group. There's CODA for Codependency Anonymous. There's Al-Anon for family and friends of people who have addictions. There's Nar-Anon, which is the version of it for addicts. So there are support networks out there that we can connect with that will help support us in moving from that over here to this. And we need help to change. None of us can change all by ourselves. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work that way. So finding friends or family that are willing to support and or going outside of that to resources in the community to help us change may be one of the things we need to do if we're going to move and try to maintain this, because if we don't get that support, the odds are real good we're going to end up back over here. Just from pressure, peer pressure, right? My family, I'm the only one in my family who, to use my term, is in recovery. And so I live over here more often, not all the time, but more often than I live over there these days. And that's been a real difficulty in my family, because this isn't where they live. They all live over here, you know? And so it can be very lonely. And so having that support network, friends and other associates and networking with people who can support me being responsible for me and not taking the responsibility of other people's behavior. I mean, I can remember, maybe some of y'all can appreciate this. I remember as a kid, let me rephrase that. I remember even as a young adult, when I would go to the movies, and back then, I'm going to really date myself here, there was this great comedian named Jerry Lewis. And he was really funny, did a lot of slapstick. That guy was like always the victim, wasn't he? He was falling over something, embarrassing himself, and I would feel embarrassed for him. Right? I would feel so embarrassed for him. It's a movie, for crying out loud, right? And I'm sitting out there feeling embarrassed for the actor or for the role that he was playing. So that idea of taking responsibility for other people's choices, their behaviors, all of those are things that one needs to begin learning how to challenge, because it's not my job. It's not my job. Any thoughts so far or questions? It would be really nice. Thank you.
I think what I found is being in recovery for a while, sometimes some of that begins to show up after I've been clean for a while with other people, where they might have been doing it to me before. Then, like, I'm kind of trying to get healthier, but I've gotten rid of the substances or whatever, but then this comes in.
Oh yeah, because that was there first.
Right.
I mean, I don't know if you've ever been in there for the codependency lecture, but one of the things that I believe is really true is that codependency is actually the foundational addiction. And so it's always there first. And without it, I mean, chemical dependency can't sustain itself, because you got to have it here as well as you got to have people around you who are willing to support it, right? So yeah, codependency is always there, and it shows up, takes a minute, but then we start blaming, right?
Or fixing.
Yeah, we start doing all that stuff, just like we've been the victim of, now we're doing it back. Yeah, and that then, of course, again, having 12-step recovery, that is really useful because it shows us another way out. But not everybody has that, which is a shame, I think. I think it's a wonderful thing to have. But yeah, it is not the only way to approach this problem. This is one way. Having support is important, but also, how do you nurture yourself? That's incredibly important. How do you nurture yourself? And I mean, even down to the food you eat. Because if we put junk in, we get junk out. Right? Well, that's true. We know that food impacts our mental state, our emotional state. There are loads of studies that show us that. And yet again, let me go back just for a moment to our American diet. There is nothing in that supports good emotional or mental health. You know? And so what are you feeding yourself physically? What are you feeding yourself emotionally? I mentioned earlier, would you hand this to you, please? I'm waving it around here. Talking earlier about that negative self-talk. Well, what am I bringing in that's going to help me combat that and challenge it? I mean, if I like to read books, we'll say books for a moment. What kind of books am I reading? Am I reading horror? Am I reading all about all the wars that have ever happened in human history? Am I reading mysteries or murder mysteries that emphasize the degradation and just sickness that is sometimes present in people? Is that what I'm feeding myself? If so, how am I going to challenge the fears that I have if all I'm doing is bringing in fear-based information? Same thing with TV. You know, I mean, if you actually sit down for a moment and go through and look at all the TV programs that are offered, how many of them are inspiring? That was a question. Do you remember any of them being inspiring anymore? There used to be a few, but there's not much out there, is there? It's all about showcasing the absolute worst of humanity. And in some cases, making the worst of humanity the hero. Like Dexter. And they get great ratings. Why? Because of this. It keeps us in this triangle. We got the bad guy, right? We got the victims, and we got the rescuer. These are the good guys. Yes, ma'am.
So, what I'm hearing, I kind of have a question about like the chicken and the egg. So, when you think about the way you're talking about, we enjoy these shows. Do you think it's because we were conditioned into thinking this way, like we all crave to be saved, or we all crave to be the hero, or we all crave these things? Do you think this is something that we are innately born with, or is this something that we've been conditioned to be like?
My belief is that it's in large part conditioning. And I say that because when we are infants, we have absolutely no sense of separation. We see and experience everything, mom, dad, the dog, everything is being a part of us. It's only as we begin to get a sense of separation that we become afraid. And fear is a real cornerstone of this, you know? And those programs keep us afraid. You know, so does the news. I mean, that's not news anymore, it's all about drama. We haven't had an honest-to-God news program in several decades that just reports news. You know, it's all about, ooh, this could mean this, and that, ooh, that might mean this, and this could happen if this happens. That's this, right? Let me give you the story and try to keep you afraid. So I believe that while there is a tendency, because we, as infants or even in the womb, we want to avoid discomfort and we move towards pleasure. That is a natural tendency. Avoid something that doesn't feel good and go towards something that does. So I think that's a basic in there. And then when we come out, which in and of itself is a pretty traumatic event for everybody involved, then we begin to separate and learn separation. Then as that happens, we begin to learn how to blame. Not me, I didn't do it. Why? Because if I say I did, mommy or daddy's going to punish me. I want to avoid that. And so I learned to lie. I learned to point the finger at my sister. Well, she hit me first. Right? So it starts very, very young. I know I've used this before as an example of how we begin to get beliefs that are not necessarily true. When I was a little girl, my mom had quite the temper. And as a little kid, when you're this big, whoever those big people are in your life, they're powerful. Physically and every other way, they're powerful because you're this big, right? And so when she would be really angry, that scared the bejeebies out of me. I'm watching my language here. That really scared me. Not because she was actually going to necessarily, threaten my life or anything, but I'm this big. It felt life-threatening. And we forget that as adults. That we don't have to be being abusive or truly life-threatening for a child to feel as if it's life-threatening. And so when she would get angry, I would get really scared. Well, I want to avoid that, right? Because when she got really angry, that usually meant I was going to get a spanking. Well, that hurt. So who wants that, right? So I want to avoid that. And my mom, and I know you're close to my age, you may have heard this before. We both have this color hair. And that is, now you look me in the eye, Shannon, and you tell me the truth. What I very quickly learned, because actually I was a really smart little kid, is that it didn't really matter if I told the truth. What mattered was whether she believed me or not. Yeah, I see that nod. You know what I'm talking about. So I learned to lie. And that seemed perfectly acceptable to me because it helped me avoid pain, right? And so I thought that was totally acceptable. Now, today I don't, but let me tell you, that took a few decades for me to truly move into a mindset of real honesty, because lying stopped things from hurting. It avoided pain. So I believe that we learn. I believe we learn. Yes, there are some natural tendencies. Evolutionarily, we tend to pay attention to those things that are scary because they get our attention, so we can avoid them, right? And we don't get eaten by the saber-toothed tiger. So there are some natural tendencies, but we're not a slave to those. We can change those things. We can learn to differentiate between what's really a saber-toothed tiger and what's just a stoplight that's stopping us from getting to work on time. We don't have to respond the same way. Does that make sense? And did that answer your question?
No, it did. It answered my question. So you're going to show us now how to not make ourselves suffer.
Well, we've started because this is what creates the suffering, right? So, yes. Oh, yay. I love questions.
Can we bounce back to nourishment for a second?
Yes.
Because you've answered my questions. They've unfolded as the lecture's gone on. And it started with the internal and external drama triangle, because typically, and then I would internalize and repeat the roles internally.
Sure.
And then you answered that with, well, healing or change doesn't happen in isolation. So that's the gift. But now I'm thinking of, well, what is nourishment? And I'm looking at the stimulus. It's like, well, what is true nourishment? Because that could look different for everyone else.
Yes.
And you kind of just answered it with the unlearning, if you will, or more continuing to question what makes one feel nourished versus someone else.
Yes.
And then my perfectionist, you always remind me I'm so sick. I'm jumping ahead to the spirit where I'm like, so
We'll
you just embody.
we'll get there in a moment. I promise. So getting back to nourishing, You're right, it certainly will be different for everyone, but these are areas that I was mentioning that we need to all be willing, again, to look at. There's nothing wrong. I love NCIS. It was one of my favorite programs. So it's not that we should not watch any of those things. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we need balance. If I'm going to watch something that tends to, when I finish with it, I may not be necessarily inspired or feeling settled, then let me do something, maybe play some calming music, something that will nourish and give me balance, right? So much in our culture is about fear and anger, and harm and, all of that stuff that we really need to put in some extra effort to create things or to listen to softer music that makes us feel calm. Learning how to be mindful. Mindfulness is a absolutely phenomenal skill to begin developing. And there's so many simple ways to begin doing that. It doesn't have to mean, yes, I will meditate, for 30 minutes a day. It could mean that, but it doesn't have to mean that. It can mean sitting down at the table in the evening and I put my food down and I just wait for a moment and appreciate the colors and the smells and the textures. That's being mindful in the moment. It's being mindful of making sure that I make eye contact with everybody in here in this moment, because this is where I'm at, not thinking about what I'm going to do Wednesday when I get to work. So mindfulness activities or behaviors or attitudes can be integrated very easily into simply how we do everything we already do. But again, our culture does not emphasize introspection. Our culture emphasizes doingness. And mindfulness is more of an internal process. It's connected to the outside, but it's about being aware of the inside in response to the outside. So if I'm going for a walk, like I did this morning, like really hearing the birds, feeling, being aware of that little bit of a breeze that would hit my face. Being in this moment rather than walking along and thinking, okay, now when I finish this, I got to get home by 10:30, and then I've got to. That's not, that just keeps me right, revved up. So practicing mindfulness techniques can begin to help us change this, because they literally change our brain structure. Mindfulness, gratitude, both of those literally change our brain structure. So does fear. So does blaming. So does anger. If I stay in those states of mind chronically, they also change my brain. Anxiety, by the way, in case anybody, we use that psychological term, anxiety, I have an anxiety. No, you don't, you have fear. Anxiety is fear. It's I'm afraid. And if we will stop and actually own that, then we can ask, well, what am I actually afraid of? But as long as it's an anxiety condition, I don't really ever have to ask, do I? So beginning to challenge the stories. Again, I keep going back to that because it's so incredibly important. So beginning to include things like mindfulness, maybe some meditation. I like to do that. To get in touch with the insides. What's going on in me? When I get that knot in the middle of my stomach before I go do a presentation, what is that telling me? I'm afraid I'm going to fail. And I practice failing, don't I? Anybody in here have performance anxieties? No? Yeah, good, thank you. So before you get ready to have to do something in front of people, what's going on in your head?
I'm playing over how it should go.
Mm-hmm.
What I need to do to
Yep.
make it better.
Better than what?
To make it go smoothly.
Smoothly, awesome. And does that increase or decrease your anxiety?
Increase.
It increases it?
Yeah.
How does it increase it? How do you increase your anxiety when you're thinking about making it better?
Because I'm not just thinking about how to make it good. I'm thinking about all the things I should do to avoid all these things. And in the same
Exactly.
time, I'm thinking about all these things that could go wrong and how they could go wrong and what happens next.
Yeah,
10 different directions.
exactly. So if you were only practicing being successful rather than practicing being a failure, because that's what anxiety is. Anxiety is practicing what we were afraid of. And I say that word deliberately. It is practicing what we are afraid of. Same thing is true if we have depression. We are practicing and repetitively, it's like we're in an endless play in our brain, and we're always replaying all that work, all that hopelessness. We are practicing hopelessness. That's what we have going on here. And so if we want to, medications can help, but they can't make this, it doesn't shut that down. We have to actually put effort into practicing something different. Most of the time, we walk around on automatic pilot, don't we? Right? I mean, we all do. This is, we just walk, and we just automatically, we open the door, we don't think about it, we walk through, we go and get this, we do that. We walk around unconscious. Mindfulness begins to wake us up. And when I am in the now, in this moment, there's usually not anything to be afraid of because I'm not here. Because worry, depression, anxiety, all that's about future. But when I'm in the now, I'm not in those possible scenarios. So practicing mindfulness can be incredibly useful in combating whatever tendencies I may have towards anxiety or depression. Another thing that can be very helpful is gratitude. Gratitude is a huge, wonderful, amazing tool. The research on gratitude is phenomenal, and it's just getting better. Now, I'm not talking about a list of all those things I should be grateful for. That is not what I'm talking about. Anybody, and you know what I mean when I say the list of all the things we should be grateful for, right? I've got a house, my health is this, right, all the shoulds. But when you think about that list, are you necessarily grateful? Probably not, right? I should be grateful, but that doesn't mean I am. So when I talk about gratitude, I'm talking about taking a moment. There's something I'm teaching at Pavillon to the people who come see me, and that is proactive gratitude. Now, what do I mean by that? It's not the list. What it is pausing. I suggest 4 times a day. Set your, if people have smartwatches, set a watch, to randomly throughout the day, bing. And in that, when you hear the bing, stop, whatever it is you're doing, and just look around. What could I be grateful for or appreciate in this moment? What could I? Maybe I don't feel it yet, but what could I appreciate in this moment? Some people showed up to hear me tonight. That's pretty awesome. I really appreciate all of y'all showing up tonight, including you who just kind of showed up and got invited. So I know V was out getting strangers coming in.
Should have grabbed the guy that was going to the woodwork.
Yeah, absolutely.
There was another one down there. He came over to me. I was sitting on the thing. I said, no, I'm here for something else.
Yeah, see? Yeah, just bring them on up. So appreciation is really huge. And gratitude literally will change how your brain is wired. But only if you feel it. The should list, sorry guys, that doesn't work. It's a place to start because I'll speak for myself. I, for decades, really didn't feel grateful for much of anything unless it was something I got my way about. And then I was grateful for about 5 seconds, and then I was more demanding. You're laughing. I hear you. So gratitude has come late in my life, and I am so grateful it has because my life is so rich. Not because anything is different, but because this is different. And gratitude makes whatever you have into enough. And so you're focused on what you have, not what you lack. And how much of our lives are spent wishing for, wanting something else. Always in that what I don't have rather than what I do have. So gratitude is another tool to help us get out of these dynamics. which keep us stuck in lack and scarcity. And it works when you allow yourself to actually feel the appreciation. If the emotion isn't there, wait. And if it still isn't there after you stopped and you found something to appreciate, and you still just can't, you know it, it's an intellectual thing, you know that you should appreciate it, but the feeling's not there, right? Then ask yourself the question, how am I stopping it? Because something in here has to actually be stopping the feeling of appreciation. If my brain goes, wow, I should really appreciate that. How am I not? How am I stopping it? Because somehow I'm not allowing the feeling to come up.
So the same thing you were talking about with the negative self-talk.
Exactly. I may look at that and go, wow, that is so cool, but, and here I go. Off on something, either a distraction or something negative. Oh, that's a beautiful flower. Oh, how beautiful, but it's going to die. Okay? That's what people do. And so again, kind of coming back to this model for a second, this is so incredibly important because it literally controls and determines the quality of our lives. Something as small, it literally controls the quality of our lives as well as our behaviors. And so when we're looking at if I don't want to be here, I've got to look at creating something different, which means I've got to take responsibility. So I'm going to ask you a quick question. What's the difference in blame and responsibility?
Blame is putting it on somebody else.
Well, don't you blame yourself too, though? And that's honestly what you shared, Greg, is like the most common first thing I always hear. And that is, well, blame is about blaming someone else, but we blame ourselves for stuff too, right? Because honestly, most of the time we don't know the difference. I don't know if you remember, McKenna, but if you do, don't say anything. Do you remember?
Well, I would say ownership, but it's not, it's either or. That's what's coming up.
I hear you. Anybody else got any ideas about what the difference is between blame and responsibility? This is a pretty important question, folks.
Responsibility like the truth and blame is like the interpretation.
What isn't an interpretation? I know, it seems like such a simple question, like we all think we know the difference. And yet the fact is, I didn't know the difference till about 10 years ago. Well, maybe 15, but because I always kind of use them interchangeably, but there really is a big difference. Blame, let's look over here for a second. Blame, has anybody ever blamed you for being an amazing young woman? Has anybody ever blamed you for being brilliant or doing a great job? Blame is always 100% negative. Always negative. It is, and it always makes you feel badly about you. Whereas responsibility, most of y'all are still working, and do you like getting a paycheck? Well, you get that because you're responsible. So responsibility can be very positive, right? Yes?
I think even if you're taking responsibility for something you did wrong, it still makes you feel better about it.
Exactly. When I'm blaming myself, I just feel crappy. When I take responsibility for it, that adds, I'm going to call it almost like a cushion, because then I can do something. Maybe it's pay a debt, maybe it's change my behavior, but I can do something about it. Whereas when I'm just blaming myself, I stay stuck. I stay stuck in this. I feel bad about me. I may continue because I do feel bad about me. I keep making bad decisions. Because after all, if I'm to blame and I'm guilty and I'm shaming myself, how am I supposed to make good decisions? How is that going to happen? It's not going to. It can't. So understanding the difference between blame and responsibility is huge to help us get out from here to over here. Because you will hear people say, well, it's my own fault. I'm just going to take responsibility. If fault and responsibility are that close together, it is not responsibility. It is blame. Because fault does not go with responsibility. Fault always goes with, I'm sorry.
Kind of gets back into that martyr thing.
Absolutely. Or to any of these. Absolutely. And that's what keeps us stuck. That's what keeps us stuck. So recognizing and beginning to truly take responsibility. And when I fail and I people please again, I don't just sit there going, oh my God, I'm never going to learn. God, here I go again. I didn't want to do that, but I did it anyway. And I just beat myself up. That's not useful. All it does is make me feel bad, and I'm more likely to keep doing it. Whereas if I look at it and I go, okay, wow, okay, I did it again. I don't like how I feel, because now I feel obligated to something I don't want to be doing. I feel like a bit resentful because I feel like I've got to do this because I told him I would, right? How did I set myself up? What was going on with me that I said yes when I really didn't want to? Because it's not about them, it's about me. How did I do that to me? Not why. How did I do it to me? What was going on inside of me that I made a decision to violate me? That I made a decision that said, I'm not as important as what you want me to do. That your wants and needs are more important than I am. How did I do that?
Goes back to fear.
Yeah. So then I can look at what is that? And as I do that, then that helps me to loosen it up a bit, and I can begin shifting this, giving different meaning to those requests. Because I have the right. I have the right to take care of me. I have the right to be just as important as you are. Because I am. I'm not more important than you are, but I am just as important as you are. And so are each and every one of you. Because you know what? When we're born, we're all equal. And that never really changes. Our intrinsic value never changes. Only this stuff changes. The lies that we come to believe about ourselves. Yes, dear.
So responsibility is a positive attitude versus the negative associated with blame.
Yes. It's always a bit more objective, like, yes, I made a mistake, but it doesn't make me a horrible person, which is what blame is typically going to make me feel. Blame is usually going to use shame and guilt, whereas responsibility doesn't do that.
And almost in just the sound, like it leaves room for growth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because it allows me to learn. If I look at my example a minute ago, if I question it, now I can begin learning what triggered me into that old behavior. If all I do is beat myself up, I'll never learn. Does that make sense? Yeah. And the final thing I want to bring up in terms of the things that we can do, oh my God, I'm running over. I'm sorry. Is my primary tool are the 12 steps. And the foundation of the 12 steps of recovery are spiritual in nature. Not religious, because that's not what it's about. It's about spiritual connection. And we talk about a higher power. Now, I'm going to put this in my words. Okay, so please forgive me. I'm going to put this in my words. We need to have a connection with something that is bigger than our egos. Because God knows we all got egos. We may not think we do because maybe we're very quiet and very shy, or maybe we don't ever put ourselves out there, or maybe we go along with it. But that's not the same, that's being submissive, but that's not the same as not having an ego. We all have egos because we have bodies. And so one of the handouts you have, would you hold that up for just a second, McKenna, is one that looks like this. It's a color one. And it's one I use at work a lot, because the only thing that ever creates problems in our lives is our ego. Spirit doesn't do that. Anybody in here ever have a moment in their life, and it could have only been just a moment. I mean, it may have been really quick, but a moment in which you felt really aligned with God as you understand him or her or it, or aligned with the universe. It might have been, sitting on a mountaintop looking at the sunrise, or maybe at the beach and the waves are coming in, or maybe it was a particular moment with a loved one, but a moment in which you had that sense of, just all's right with the world. Everybody had one of those? Awesome. Real quick, give me words to describe what that was like.
Peaceful.
I'm sorry? Peaceful. Thank you. Please speak up because I'm hard of hearing. What else?
Blissful.
Blissful?
Unexplainable.
Content.
What else?
Calm.
Awe. I heard another word.
Calm.
Calm?
Clarity. Clarity.
Clarity? What else?
Verification, like validation, like I'm in the right place at the right time.
Happiness.
Happiness?
Safe. Safe.
I can't hear you.
Safe.
Safe.
Present
Present?
and alive.
Anything else you can think of?
Hopeful.
Any other words? Okay, so question. When you're in this moment, all those resentments you have had in your life? Where are they when they're here? What about all those guilts and the shames? Right? Where are they when you're here? They're not there, are they? Because over here, there's absolutely no judgment, is there? There are no problems. When we are connected, what I would call connected to spirits, quantum physicists would be talking about the Plancks and all this other stuff, and the informational field and so forth, which probably is about the same thing, because it's certainly bigger than we are. But none of that other stuff is here, is it? When we are in that moment, all that other stuff vanishes. Now, we all know that none of us live there every moment of the day. In fact, we're lucky if we get a moment like this every once in a while, right? So when we're not here, what's coming up?
Shame.
What else?
Pain.
What else?
Stress.
Stress.
Anxiety, conflict, fear.
You're on a roll here, girl.
Plant your feet, McKenna.
Thank you.
Resistance.
Judgment. Whoops.
Regret.
Worry,
Second guessing.
Reed said resistance.
I'm sorry.
Resistance.
Resistance. Wow, it's a big difference in those two, isn't there? So, to speak program language for just a minute, where do you think happy, joyous, and free is going to land? It kind of becomes clear, doesn't it? If I'm over here feeding this, by the things I'm reading, the things I'm listening to, the things I'm watching, the people I hang out with. Everybody I hang out with likes to sit around and gossip. Oh, I don't gossip, but I do listen, right? Or, you know what I'm saying? All of that is here. How will there ever be happy, joyous, and free over here? Ain't gonna happen. So I call that ego. And this side I would call spirit. Now, my job is to do those things that encourage movement. Not that I'm going to necessarily live here. I'm not a saint, and I don't know if they live here either. But doing those things that help me move in that direction. When I do that, this loses its power. All of this codependency stuff begins to lose its power. But that takes effort. Because this is the world. This is the world. It takes effort for me to break away from this and move towards there. And again, mindfulness, meditation, looking at what I eat, what I'm nurturing myself with, the books I read, the things I listen to, the people I hang out with the most. You know, I love my family, but, you know, I don't hang out with them. And it makes it easier because we don't live close together. And there's a reason for that. You know, just because that's just not where my head is anymore, most of the time. Most of the time, you know? So how am I nourishing this side of the board? The ego is a source of all of the problem, or the perception of problems. It tells me that it compares us, and you've got this lush gray hair and mine's thinning, and I'm jealous. Oh. I mean, that's what the ego does. It's always comparing. And when we compare, nobody comes out this way, do they? There's always one here and one here. And depending on what my self-talk is, I fluctuate, right? I look better than, I'm smarter than, I'm less than, I'm whatever, right? It's always one or the other. So cultivating those things that move me this way will help me in the long run change this, which helps me stay out of this. Does that make sense, folks? Was that it for those of you who who understand codependency? Was that helpful in terms of giving direction? Okay, awesome. All right, any thoughts or finishing questions? Because that went way over time.
I think you did a wonderful job.
Thank you.